So why is aquaculture important? This is a graph, again, from FAO, and you'll see this probably in any aquaculture presentation you see. And it shows the total global seafood production in millions of metric tons. On the y-axis here, we got 1950 all the way to 2018. These sort of orange hues represent the capture fisheries, and the blue represent the aquaculture production coming out of aquaculture, both freshwater and marine, and again down here, freshwater and marine for the capture fisheries as well. A few things to notice. Although aquaculture is an ancient practice, it's been going on for thousands of years, primarily in Asia, but also in some of the indigenous cultures here in the Pacific Northwest, for example, in Puget Sound with the clam gardens. Hawaii, they have their ancient fish ponds. So that, it's been happening for thousands of years, but it really hasn't hit the numbers to really register at a global level until about the 1970s, when both the understanding of how to grow these animals and the culture techniques that are involved, and also the species, biology of the species, really began to get dialed in for some of these species here. And then another point to notice here is in 1990, we see this plateau in terms of the capture fishery. And when you see it this way, it's actually quite stark. We hear about maximum sustainable yield and overfishing the oceans and all that. But when you look at total global capture fisheries landing, it's completely flatlined since about the 90s. Human population has increased. Human population has also become more affluent, and they're able to afford more seafood, more meat, protein. And so you see aquaculture taking up filling the void, meeting that demand. And in 2018, roughly, you can see here that about 50%, slightly less than 50% of the total global seafood production is being provided through aquaculture. Another unique thing I think about this FAO data is they seldom include aquatic plants, and aquatic plants aren't included here, and that includes the kelps, the reds and brown kelps that we were just looking at. So you can tack on another 30 million metric tons up here of cultured seaweed, and now aquaculture is providing well over 50% of the global seafood production. So a very significant source of human food.
Ford, there's a question in the chat. What is the difference between aquaculture and aquaponics?
Interesting. Aquaponics, that's a mashup of essentially aquaculture and hydroponics. So it could be considered a kind of aquaculture. In fact, I had an aquaponics little setup in my backyard for a while. It was a lot of fun. But in this case, you're growing, it's typically something like fish, which is grown in conjunction with terrestrial plants more times than not. So tomatoes and basil and these types of things. But it's a fantastic system, a nice co-culture system. Nutrients from the fish feed into fertilize the plants. Plants essentially filter the water, which can then be returned back to the fish tank. A lot of fun. I can go on, but we can talk about that more.
I have a quick question too as well. This is Melissa. I did a program in Houston, hydroponics. Is that where they're growing them with plants, and then that you're able to do it through sunlight, or what's the process?
Hydroponics. It's essentially soilless production of plants, and it's the aquaponics. That's the name they've given when you incorporate fish. They talk about aquaponics.
Okay.
So yeah, a little different there, but yeah, it's all driven by sunlight because it's the plants that are providing the filtration. It's actually the plants that you end up, I think more times than not, if it's a commercial operation, it's the plants that you end up selling and making most of your money. It's nice to have the fish in there as a nutrient source. Yeah. Okay, quick just comment that most of the aquaculture production is occurring in Asia. That's actually where there's most of the seafood demand as well. So if we take a look at the United States, not a big player in terms of global production, less than 1% of the aquaculture production occurs here in the US. Having said that, looking at some USDA 2018 data, there's just under 3,000 aquaculture farms in the US, and they provide about $1.5 billion in sales. So it's a nice industry. There's a lot of interest in increasing that. We run a seafood deficit here in the US, so we import a lot of our seafood. So there's a lot of interest in sort of bolstering, increasing our domestic seafood production, and they're trying to bring in aquaculture as a way to do that. So most of us are here in Oregon. We're going to talk about oysters in Oregon. So a quick little snapshot of Oregon. Again, this USDA aquaculture census data reports 38 aquaculture farms in Oregon with a total sales of $23.7 million annual sales. What is interesting, however, when you break down the sales, you see that 84% of that is accounted for through the sales of mollusks. And mollusks are essentially what we're talking about here, are shellfish. And most of the shellfish grown in Oregon are oysters. So it's interesting to see that it's a small, relatively small industry here in Oregon, but it's driven primarily by the oyster industry, which is nice. Well, it's nice if you live on the coast, because this is a nice infusion into the coastal economy here. So what are oysters? Just very briefly, they are marine animals. They live in the marine environment, in the brackish environment. They can live in estuaries. They are bivalve mollusks. Mollusks are snails and shellfish, clams, etc. Bi meaning two here, and valve meaning shell. They do have two shells. One is typically quite flat. The other is a nice deep cup. More hopefully, it has a nice cup. And this is, if you ever have oysters on the half shell, the meat is going to be presented in that cup, held in that cup and presented on ice and so forth. So a nice deep cup is something that farmers look for, try to achieve in their farming. A little bit more about their biology. They're broadcast spawners. So the males release sperm into the water column, females release eggs, hopefully synchronized with tides or temperature. And fertilization is external. There's then about a 3-week period, larval period, where the oysters are actually tiny free swimming plankton. They're about maybe 300 micrometers across. They're quite small. But what they'll do is they'll swim around. They're plankton, they're being washed around, but they have the ability to swim up and down, and they'll bounce off the seafloor, the substrate, looking for a nice place to cement themselves where they will live for the rest of their lives. That is an interesting aspect, an important part of their life stage, but where we're used to seeing them really is in their sessile form. So these are animals that are cemented to the ocean floor or to the substrate on the seafloor. And one of their favorite places to cement is on other oyster shells. So you end up having this situation, for instance, this is a picture of the eastern oyster on the East Coast, where these oysters have created a oyster reef. And this is a very important ecosystem service that's provided by these oysters on what it might be an otherwise rather monotonous estuary seafloor. Now you have some hard structure which can provide habitat for other animals and plants and so forth. They're also filter feeders. Oysters, both as adults and as in their larval stage, they're filter feeders. The adults have the ability to really discriminate food from non-food, and they will use their gills to pull water into across their gills, where they'll both breathe but also feed. Hairs on the gills will collect phytoplankton, microscopic single-celled algae, captured on their gills, and then basically just transport it into their mouth. So this filtering process is recognized as another ecosystem service that can actually pull nutrients out of the water, particularly in environments that have too much nutrients, have suffered from eutrophication. So a lot of nutrients, maybe a lot of algae blooms going on. Oysters can go in there and help clear up the water anyway. So they have a couple really good ecosystem services there. But what we're going to talk is oysters about seafood. So I guess maybe we'll do the poll now. And we're going to, if all goes as planned, we'll pull up a poll. basically asking you if you like oysters, if you think oysters are okay, if you dislike oysters, or if you've never had oysters before. And let me know if that, should I do, oh no, there we go. It's happening. Okay, if everyone's responded. And this is not uncommon, what we see here. I'm glad to see that most all of you have tried oysters before. People, well, there's a few that think, there's one that think it's okay, but oftentimes you see people who either absolutely love oysters or think they're gross and slimy and slippery and all that sort of stuff. So we do have one. I might be in, sort of in that middle ground too. I hate to say it. Kristen, I know, is a huge fan. I've seen her in action at the oyster farms. So, okay, well, thank you. Whoops. All right, they do come, I'll just make a comment here. That you can see them marketed in a variety of forms. Here is my example of oysters on the half shell. Again, here you're seeing the meat presented in the cupped shell. So it's a good presentation. Typically, you'll see this in restaurants. You can also buy single oysters. If you go to the seafood market, buy a dozen or so oysters to take home to barbecue or however you choose to eat it. If you don't want to deal with the oyster shell, you can also buy just the meats. So this is the shucked product. Shucked just refers to the removal of the meat from the shell. And also there's some sort of post-harvest value-added products out there, such as canned oysters and smoked and so forth. So you'll see it in a variety of forms. And with that, let me go into how oysters are farmed. And I'm going to be we're going to focus in on two farms here on the, in Oregon. The farming of the oysters relies heavily on their life stage. So I talked about this larval phase, and then they have this adult phase, which is non-swimming. It's life on the bottom. And so the farming of it reflects these two different life stages. There's going to be one component of the overall husbandry here that just focuses on the larval phase. They'll do this hatchery, we call them hatcheries. They'll do this, they'll fertilize the eggs, they'll raise the larvae from eggs. Here is what we call a veliger larvae. Here you can see this is called the velum. This is how the baby oyster larvae swim. All these cilia beat and they can swim up and down in the water column. As they age, let's say about 2 weeks old, they begin to develop a foot. So this is called a pediveliger larvae, pedi meaning referring to foot. And they actually use this to crawl along the bottom and evaluate the substrate and determine if that is a place that they're going to want to live the rest of their lives, or do they swim back up into the water column and get swept off to a different part of the reef or a different reef altogether. So when the hatchery personnel see pediveliger larvae, they know that it's time to package up the larvae as best they can. And that's the product that they end up selling to their customers, which are going to be the grow out, what we call the grow out farms. These are farms that will take these larvae, allow them to set onto a substrate. We're going to talk about the setting tank shortly. Allow them to set onto some form of substrate. Typically, it's old, clean oyster shell. They'll allow them to set on this and then raise these tiny animals. Each one of these dots here are a oyster larvae that has attached to the oyster shell, cemented itself there, and metamorphosed from this free swimming larvae into basically its adult form. If you take a close look at these little guys here, they'd look like tiny adult oysters, and you just let them grow for another, typically in the Pacific Northwest, it'll be 2 years until they reach market size. You plant them out onto your farm site, let them grow for 2 years, and that's usually results in a marketable product there. So we have two different components to production. One are the hatcheries that focus on the free swimming larvae, and the other component, the other farms that focus on the grow out and raising of these animals until they reach market size. So to do this, we ended up taking a look at 2 different farms here in Oregon. The first was Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery. This is located in Netarts Bay, just south of Tillamook here. And this is a farm that focuses on just the larval phase of the oysters. And they produce about 1 billion oyster larvae per year. They sell their product, their oyster larvae would be the pedovelliger larvae, the animals that are just about ready to set onto cement themselves to something solid. They sell their product to grow out farms, such as Oregon Oyster Farm. And this is the grow out farm that we ended up modeling in our app. And Oregon Oyster Farm is located in Yaquina Bay, a little bit east of Newport there, and they produce over 1 million adult oysters per year. And this is the food, they ended up selling sort of the food product at size animal. So what I want to do is sort of walk through what happens at the hatchery and then walk through what happens at the grow out phase. So we start off at Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery. They're actually located just across the street from Netarts Bay. They pump their water in from Netarts Bay. They do filter the water, and that's to take out sediment and any sort of fouling animals. And then they can also, what they are doing routinely now is also treat the water, they buffer the water, and that is to prevent overly acidic seawater from coming in and essentially killing all the animals, all the oyster larvae. You may have heard about ocean acidification. One of the first places that we began seeing significant economic impacts of ocean acidification here in Oregon was on just the complete decimation of the oyster larvae industry, which had fallout for the grow out end of things as well. But they will fertilize eggs here, grow out the oyster larvae in these commercial size tanks, 20,000 liter larval tanks. It's filled with nice warm seawater, filtered seawater. They provide, here's a little air stone going in. They provide a little bit of air, a very good growing environment, including basically as much single-celled algae or food as they'd like. So you can think of this as phytoplankton, microscopic algae. They have to grow all of this larval food on site, and this is what the animals are going to filter out of the seawater. But they, just like any other plant, algae or plants, they will provide fertilizer into these water, into the tanks, provide lots of light, and you get this, this rapid growth of algae, which they will then pump into these giant larval culture tanks. So it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for the oyster larvae to get to the point where they want to set onto something solid, at which point the hatchery folks are going to sell them to the grow out farms. This is a video just showing some oyster larvae. 2 things to notice. One, you can see the cilia beating on the vellum of these larvae here, and that's how they're swimming. The other thing to notice is this one's a pedovelliger larvae, and you can see the muscular foot sticking out of the shell here. It's crawling along the substrate here, looking for some place to set. So when the hatchery folks see this happening, they know the animals are mature enough and ready to set. So they're going to package these things up and send them off to their customers. The way they do that is drain these enormous 20,000 liter larval tanks, catching the oyster larvae on fine mesh sieve. So there's a 100 micron sieve here. What looks like sand or mud here, that's actually all of the oyster larvae being condensed onto these sieves. This is Alan Barton, the manager at the hatchery there. He's rinsing out the oyster larvae into these cones. There's these long cones, which we'll see in a couple slides. And that's just a way that they're able to quantify how many oyster larvae they have and how many they want to send out to their customers. So this is I'll just take a moment here to show this is some video footage that they got for us. I'm going to hit play. We sort of bounce along as we zoom in, and it'll eventually come back into focus. But what you're going to see is these little tiny dots. And this is the oyster larvae that Alan has just cleaned off, rinsed into this, out of the tank, rinsed in here. But what you can see is the oyster larvae are indeed swimming. And it's actually a vertical migration that you're seeing. They'll swim to the surface and then they'll stop swimming and they'll fall down to the bottom. Then they'll swim back up and fall down. This is a swimming behavior that allows them essentially to bounce off the substrate, evaluate the substrate. If it's not good and it's not a good place for them to live the rest of their lives, they'll swim back up into the water column and get swept along to another location, which hopefully has good, a good substrate. Many of them don't make it, but they're trying to find a good place to live the rest of their lives. So what Alan ends up doing is that if you leave them alone, the oyster larvae will settle down and he can then dispense a known volume and he can translate that volume into actual oyster counts onto something that's equivalent to like cheesecloth here. They then bundle these packages up of sort of a known number of oyster larvae and then ship them off to their customers. It's a very efficient way of doing it. There's hardly any water involved. This is almost 100% oyster larvae in a paste-like form, bundles it up, puts it in here with the ice pack and ships it overnight to wherever their customers happen to be. They could be, could be a regional customer or it could be across the country. In the case of Oregon oyster, they don't have to go too far. But you can see in this case, he's shipping off in one of these bundles 11 million oyster larvae that are being sent off to an oyster grow-out farm. What happens next here, now we're moving to Oregon Oyster Farm in Yaquina Bay. This is the farm that's going to grow them out to market size. This is Lucien here. He's the owner of Oregon Oyster Farm. He's just opened up one of these packets of oyster larvae here. He's actually showing it to some students who are touring the facility. Now, in anticipation of receiving these petavelliger larvae, Lucien has added culch. So this is clean oyster shell. And this is the substrate that he's going to want the oyster larvae to set onto. So he's put these into a tank, with the setting tank, filled it up with nice, warm, clean seawater, and also added a lot of aeration. So there's a lot of bubbling. It's a well-mixed tank. He's going to take this packet of larvae, basically put it into this tank, let the larvae get well mixed, exposed to all of this very good substrate that's sitting in there waiting for them to settle on. The oyster larvae are old enough and wanting to set on something. So if all goes as well, you end up with a situation like this. Each one of these here again are oyster larvae that have settled onto the substrate, in this case, the culch, which is the oyster shell here. And they've metamorphosed from this free swimming form to their adult form. And now they just need to grow these individuals out for a couple more years until they reach market size. And at this stage, this juvenile stage here, they're referred to as spat. So this is spat on culch here. So this is sort of the unit that they end up working with in many ways. And we'll see how that sort of gets spread around their farms here. This is Oregon Oyster Farms. They produce market size oysters in two primary ways. One is an off-bottom culture and one is an on-bottom culture. I'll start with the off-bottom culture. So this is a processing pier that they have at Oregon Oyster Farm. This is another building that's there. This is sort of their retail facility. This is where they do a lot of the shucking happens in this building. But right offshore, they have these floating rafts in relatively deep water. And for the off-bottom culture, what they do is they take this piece of culch. You can see here, this old oyster shell. On it are a good, about 10 or so oyster spat. They'll take these and then basically insert them into this polypropylene line. And these are actually two lines that are doubled up. They're typically maybe about 18 inches or so separated. They'll take this line and drape it over cross members on these rafts. What happens is the oyster culch with the spat on it are now suspended in the water column. It's a very good growing environment. It's also away from predators like crabs that are on the bottom. So if all goes as planned, and Mother Nature takes it from here, Mother Nature's supplying the phytoplankton, hopefully the water temperature stays within the right range, etc. Water quality is good. If everything goes as planned, you come back about 2 years later, and now you have these essentially basketball or larger size clusters what used to be tiny juvenile spat are now adult size, and you have these giant clusters of oysters. These are then taken to the processing pier where they're processed for market. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's the off-bottom approach. There's also an on-bottom approach, which is a little simpler in some ways. Here they just take this culch that has the spat attached to them, and they spread them on the sea floor, essentially. And again, this is farming, so they're going to spread them on leased sites that they have rights to. And again, wait a couple of years. They'll take out their barge. This is the Tom B, Oregon Oysters dredge barge, and use this metal dredge to scoop up those oyster clusters, which are now on the bottom. They'll scoop them up, dispense them into these bins, and then take this back to the processing pier, and again, process those for market, which we'll show next. And this is just a very quick summary of the processing that goes on. Essentially, they end up breaking up these big clusters, rinsing them off, trying to get all the fouling off as best they can. And then they'll sort through what comes out. And in some cases, you may have some good-looking single oysters that have a nice oyster shape. They have that nice deep cup. And if that's the case, then they can sell these animals as what we call singles, and they're sold by the count. So 5 dozen, 4 dozen, and these are going to be shipped off to restaurants probably. But the idea here is you have a relatively attractive oyster. It has a nice deep cup so that you can do things like oysters on the half shell, or sell them bagged like this as individuals for people to take home barbecue and so forth. So this is when they're sold as singles. Now, in some cases, the oysters have grown together in such a way that there's no way you're going to get them apart, or they've grown in a way where they don't have deep cups. They're maybe long and skinny and flat and so forth. Those don't make it to the restaurant. Those get shucked. So here's a case where the process of shucking, we're removing the meat from the shell. And humans do this. So this is the shucker. And these employees are skilled at opening up these oyster shells, a dozen per minute or so. And they open them up, put the meat into these stainless steel bins, throw the shells off to the side, and just keep on moving it through. The oyster meats are then transferred to a cleaning facility where they're actually rinsed with water. This is actually a bubbling sort of vat here that helps clean off the oyster meat. And then in this big stainless steel tray here, you see more rinsing is going on. And here they can also physically grade them by size, which is, again, an important factor in the marketability of these products. So the meats then are sold as only meat, usually by volume. So here's a 16-ounce tub of oysters, and then these would be the ones that would eventually be, if you did want to smoke them, et cetera, you can do some value added on this end. In all cases, I'll just wrap up by saying that there can be size preferences. In the domestic market, it's typically a smaller sized animal that is attractive for either oyster on the half shell or as meats. Export, however, they make a lot of money selling very large oysters, which might be larger than most here domestically would prefer, but particularly going to Asia, they actually charge quite a bit for those larger animals. Okay, I'll stop there. That sort of gives you an overview of some of the biology that we're working with and the process that's involved. So I will leave you, I think, and I can take any questions now too. I'll leave you with this shot of Tillamook Bay. This might be familiar to some of you, but this is an oyster ground at Tillamook Bay. Let me stop sharing. Is that?
How do they determine the price of selling the oyster? I can't say the name. That determine how do you charge if they have 11 million? You know what I mean? How do you determine that?
Yeah, so the larvae, that's a good question. I think it's sort of what the market will demand in terms of pricing those animals. Reputation is pretty important here. Your animals If they don't set, for example, if you purchase a bunch of if you're a grow out farm, you've purchased some larvae, you can almost think of it like seeds, going to a seed manufacturer. If they don't perform well, you're going to go somewhere else. And so people have the option to do that. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I said, so it kind of like varies like the price of tuna based on the market, and then whatever you have and quality kind of thing. It's, you know, reputation, like you said, precedes it. And
yeah, and certainly for the seed, and then the market, the larger animals, there is a seasonality that's involved there, but also size, as I mentioned. There's also species that come into play here, 2 different species. There is a Kumamoto oyster, and that is actually one that is, it is a different species, and it's a small animal that's very deeply cupped. So it is very popular for the half shell market. There's a native oyster. Interesting, the oysters that I'm talking about, I'm sort of ashamed to say, these are all originally from Asia, from Japan. They were brought over to the century, 1900s, when you could do these sorts of things. Fortunately, because of the temperature, it's a warm water species. The temperatures here typically, and it's sort of knock on wood here, typically are cold enough where they won't reproduce and establish themselves. There are exceptions. Willapa Bay is an exception. There's some places in Puget Sound where there are naturalized populations, but it hasn't totally, the Pacific oyster hasn't totally overrun the Pacific Northwest. Interestingly, too, the native oyster is often seen set. We talk about oyster shells being very good substrate for oysters. The native oysters, which a lot of people are interested in restoring and trying to increase those populations, they love to set on top of Pacific oyster shells. So okay, it might be helping in some cases. But anyways, they also sell the native oyster, which is quite small, very niche sort of market. But
and do all oysters produce? I'm thinking is clams. Who produces the pearls? Clams or oysters?
That's a good question. It is a pearl oyster. The one that produces the good oysters, the good pearls, is a different species altogether. Almost not recognizable as an oyster. It does look sort of scallopy, but these Pacific oysters will produce pearls, but they're usually not. I think it's very rare, and it's not. The market quality is subpar, shall we say? But so.
Thank you.
Ford, is there any byproduct, like with other ag commodities, that it's like almond hulls we feed to dairy cattle? Is there any? What do they do with the shells, I guess?
Yeah, so shells are the primary byproduct. So interesting history there. When for instance, on the East Coast, the native Eastern oyster, when they were harvesting those, they would pull the animals out with the shell and then use the shell for all sorts of things, gardens, roads, to the point where none of the oyster shells went back. And that's a problem because the oysters actually for those reefs, need the shell to remain in the water as substrate to set on. So that was it. People began to learn that, no, we can't just take the shells, we need to put them back if we want these reefs to continue. So that was an interesting lesson learned. There is something to be said, I believe, also for the carbonate chemistry to help buffer the seawater. People are talking about that more in terms of ocean acidification too. So there could be an advantage about keeping shells in the water there too. But that's the primary byproduct. The rest is sold in one capacity or another.
Any other questions? You can just unmute or you can put it in the chat or we move on.
Supplemented chicken feed I see is in the okay, good to hear.
How do they pay for the space? Like if we were to lease, I'm thinking Eastern Oregon, we lease land to grow.
Yeah.
How do they pay for the space in the water?
It is a leased situation. And permitting this may be the case with any sort of agriculture, but permitting is one of the biggest barriers that people will say is keeping them out of the water, so to speak. I think it is confusing with Oregon Department of Ag, Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. I don't know if the Corps of Engineers get involved, and all these sorts of things sort of overlap where it turns into a nightmare. Local governments too, in Tillamook, I imagine, as well. But it's typically a leased situation. I don't know the terms, how long and so forth, but it'd be similar to that.
Thank you. Any other questions?
No, but it was informative. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
So Kristen's going to share the apps. Kristen and Ford are going to walk us through that.
Hey folks, can y'all hear me? Make sure I can see all of your faces.
Yes.
So I'm acting as Eat today. So Eat was not able to join us, and Eat usually does the showing of the app. So I will do my best to do this because he makes it look so seamless. So let me get my screen sharing on my phone going. See my phone. Cool. Okay. You see my puppy. All right. My lovely desk. Put you up here. Mm-hmm. Always takes me a second.
Kristen, I did notice when I was tinkering this afternoon, I noticed that the farm would sometimes show up behind me. We can talk to Yeet about that.
Yeah, sometimes with the beta version, it's like on my end, sometimes it's like super small. And so it does take a second to, I hope it's not behind me. Where is he?
So while Kristen's getting ready, we'll just, she'll let us know when she's ready. As you were going through this, did you think of any new ways you could use this in your classroom? So for example, I had all those questions because we're in Eastern Oregon. I've never lived by water, the ocean. And so we take kids even on field trips and they always want to go to the ocean. We took them to summer conference. They went on a field trip, didn't even get to put their feet in the water. So, looks like she's up. Looks like you're up, Kristen.
Thank y'all for being so patient with me.
Yeah, no worries.
This is more user error, so don't judge the quality of this because this is based on this is what it looks like. Let me see if I can move them. Okay.
So what we did here, just to interject real quick, you see, you can sort of recognize Oregon Oyster Farm there with the pier and the building. We ended up putting Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery right next to it, or a sort of cartoon version of it. And that was for obvious logistical reasons, as opposed to having to digitize the entire Oregon coast. That's the Bay Road there. If you ever have a chance to go to Newport, I recommend taking that out of town. It's a lovely drive.
Can y'all still hear my audio?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So for to be ready, I think we should start with the oyster.
Okay, that sounds good.
Here it is.
This is our digitally scanned oyster, which will be hovering in your living room.
Yeah, so this is a 3D model of the oyster.
Its mammals. See those holes on the oyster shell? Those are actually barnacles living on the oyster shell. Growing oyster shells are sensitive to their environment, especially the surrounding water chemistry. Ocean acidification occurs when the water pH lowers, making ocean water more acidic. This causes oyster shells to grow thin and brittle, or even slow or stop shell growth completely. Protecting oyster reefs is important to support healthy ocean ecosystems.
Okay, so that was an example of a slideshow. Sorry, the volume of my phone was off. So hopefully y'all could hear the video. This is another really cool pin to show.
As oysters age, they get bigger and so do their shells. Oysters can live to be over 30 years old, grow to be over 15 years old. Much like the rings on a tree, scientists can use the rings on the shell to help estimate where the oysters age. The shape of the oyster shell depends on where the oyster grows. If the seafloor is soft or muddy, oyster shells can grow to be very long and narrow. However, oyster farmers grow oysters that have more rounded shells because people like to buy and eat round oysters. To raise oysters with a nice round shape, farmers typically grow oysters on a firm seafloor or mesh patterns. And not every oyster shell looks the same. Next time you see an oyster, look closely at the shell. You can see some oysters have dark or light shells, and others have unique banding patterns.
Ooh. All right, so that was another example of a slideshow. This one's pretty cool.
Like tadpoles, very young oysters can swim. When oysters are about 2 to 4 weeks old, they stop swimming and find a place to attach and grow. One of their favorite places to attach is on clean and deep oyster shells. Piles of oyster shells from growing young oysters and form large reefs. These reefs can increase biodiversity by providing habitat for other plants and animals. As oysters grow, they make shells of their own, where they can accumulate and store carbon. This prevents carbon from being released into the atmosphere, so oysters are our partner in helping climate change.
It's a little spooky to watch.
I don't think so. So that was a hologram. So I know we get to have. Oh my gosh. Sorry. My parents live on the East Coast, so this is their time that they like to call me. All right. So let's make this better.
Yeah, the idea was we'd have this oyster as one that would highlight sort of the biology and some of the ecosystem services. And then these other areas are the farm components. Oh yeah. This is Alan Barton, the manager at the Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery. He's inside of an oyster larval tank. And this is a 360 video. So Kristen is now going on her own, looking up and down and around and all that at this giant oyster tank. That's what the students would be able to do. So I think that's kind of fun.
Let's see. Big oyster still here.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. So this is Alan rinsing out the larvae that are ready to be shipped off. There he is packaging them up. And I think there is audio for this, but I guess it's not happening, which is okay.
Yeah. Let's see if I can get this big oyster to leave. Okay. So let's check this out. So this is an example of a Panaguide. So it's a 360 still picture. So kids can look around and see all of these big tanks. Or I don't know if you want to describe what these things are.
Yeah, these are on the left are the larval tanks, those giant larval tanks. And on the right are the tanks where they're growing the phytoplankton, the algae. So you can see the lights suspended above those tanks. It's also a sort of a greenhouse-like roof there. So they do try to capitalize on natural sunlight where they can. And you can see how dark that water was. That was, we'll see here, that means it's very densely populated with algae. These are some of the starter cultures for these algae tanks. They start off very small, and basically they just, as the algae cells multiply, they move them into larger and larger containers. So here we're moving into larger containers. Light is being provided, air is being provided, and just like terrestrial plants, they need CO2 to photosynthesize. So it's a temperature-controlled room, trying to optimize algae growth. This is how it all sort of starts. And they go into larger and larger containers. Ultimately ending up in these large ones where they're pumped out into the larval tanks. These are essentially sparklets, bottle-sized culture units, again with the air is being provided, light is being provided. They would have fertilized this water.
What's the difference in the colors in this one?
Yeah, so the colors are different species, and they do tend to mix species, and it's essentially to give them a balanced diet. Fatty acid profiles and all that sort of stuff.
Half of the algae culture is pumped into the giant tanks for oyster larvae or something. This means dinner time for the oysters. More clean water can be added to the now half-empty algae tank to grow the algae within. This cycle is repeated several times before oyster hatchery farmers have to start at the beginning with fully stocked starters.
What's that? All right. Let's go to sitting.
Oyster larvae need to find a suitable place to grow for the rest of their lives. Clean, empty oyster shells are oyster larvae's preferred place to attach. When oyster larvae attach to their meat bed, this process is called setting. Right near the setting tank, farmers are helping oyster larvae grow. The setting tank is filled with warm seawater and clean, empty oyster shells called colch. Oyster larvae that are ready to set are shipped from oyster hatchery farmers and placed in the setting tank with plenty of colch to find as a home. The setting process can take several days. Oyster farmers aim to have 10 oyster larvae grow on each new piece of colch.
That one was cool because that was actually some of the Dive for Ag teams that came with us, and they got to actually do that. So that was a cool video. Let's see.
The meat one is interesting too, if we want to head that way.
Unless you want to go to which time? Oh. Let's do it.
Oyster farmers raise oysters to adulthood in different ways. With each clean, empty oyster shell, the colch has 10 oyster larvae attached. It's time for the farmers to move the colch into the sea. Oyster farmers can spread the colch on the seafloor or, as shown here, attach them to floating rafts. Like a winner, each piece of colch is braided into a rope strand and then tied along the floating raft boards. This allows the oysters to grow suspended in the seawater. Oysters growing suspended from floating rafts will reach market size after about 2 years. Oyster farmers harvest these now heavy oyster ropes using a crane to hoist the lines to the processing pier.
So that's one of the cool pieces, is that there's different ways that they can grow. Is they can grow on these rafts like this, or oysters can grow here.
Oysters grow to adulthood in different ways, including spreading them along the seafloor. Oyster larvae attached to clean, empty oyster shells, or colch, grow to market size on the seafloor after 2 years. The longer an oyster grows, the bigger it gets. Some people like the taste of fried oysters. Oyster farmers make decisions to let oysters on the seafloor grow longer than 2 years. When it is time to harvest, oyster farmers dredge oysters along the seafloor and transport them to the processing pier on their boats.
And that was a 360 video, is that right?
Yep. So I was able to move around. So that was really cool. You actually saw us when we went to go visit with the teams. So we actually got to go on the boat, which was pretty cool. All right, so that's how they grow.
After growing for 2 years in the bay water, oysters are ready to be harvested. Oyster farmers use a barge with specialized equipment to collect oysters. Oysters growing on rafts are picked up with a crane, while oysters growing on the seafloor are dredged up with a large metal basket. The barge then transports the oysters to the processing pier.
So that was pretty cool. All right, so we're on the tabletop. I did a really cool job of like making it look like the facilities.
Mm-hmm.
After harvesting oysters that were growing on rafts or on the seafloor, oysters are brought to the processing pier. Their first stop is a quick power wash to clean off mud before moving down the conveyor belt. Farm staff break up clusters of oysters into whole, single oysters and sort out any broken and empty shells. After being separated, oysters are sent through the tumbler to take off any extra pieces of shells that might still be attached. Coming out of the tumbler, oysters are ready to be sorted for sale.
That was a really cool one too, is a compilation of 360 videos. So I was kind of moving it around so you could see.
Yeah, that is cool for the student or the operator to sort of dictate what's being looked at. You also saw in that video them trying to break apart those clusters and get more of the single oysters out of them.
That's the processing here.
After harvesting and cleaning, oysters are sorted and graded by size and shape. This picture here shows 3 different kinds of oysters, as well as different sizes. The top 2 oysters are native oysters here in Oregon. They grow naturally and are harvested along with the planted oysters. The 2 below them are Kumamoto oysters. These oysters are all about the same size and are sold as singles and are considered a delicacy. The bottom 2 rows are Pacific oysters, which have a greater variety in size. These oysters are sorted by size and are either sold as singles in the shell or they are shucked to sell with meat. Single oysters are sorted and graded by size into baskets before being boxed and properly labeled. Each of these boxes contains either 4 or 5 dozen oysters, depending on their size. These boxes are ready to ship to restaurants all around the world.
Let's do some sorting.
Once the oysters are shucked and their shells are removed, oyster meat is cleaned in a big pot of water. Next, the oyster meat is moved to a large sorting table. Oyster Farm staff then sort the oyster meat by hand into different containers. Oyster meat is sorted by size because different customers prefer different sizes of oysters. Some people like the smallest petite-sized oysters and say it can taste sweet, like clean singular. Other people prefer extra large oyster meat because it tastes meaty and buttery.
This is making me super hungry. Okay, let me make sure where is the shucking?
I think was it right below the sorting?
Here it is.
Right.
Sometimes oyster meat is sold without the shell. The process of opening the oyster and removing the meat is called shucking. This is done using a knife to cut the muscle that holds the 2 shells together. An expert shucker can process a dozen oysters in just 1 minute. Here at the Oregon Oyster Farm, the crew can shuck 5,000 to 7,000 oysters in a day.
That's probably one of the coolest stuff.
You can make the farm-to-table experience happen with oysters by buying directly from an oyster farmer. Here at Oregon Oyster Farm, you can buy freshly shucked oyster meat in a variety of sizes. Or you can buy oysters in their shell by the dozen and shuck them at home. Oyster farmers also work closely with restaurants to supply fresh oysters. One way to enjoy oysters in a restaurant is ordering a dozen fresh on a half shell. The oyster meat is presented in a curved, cupped oyster shell with different toppings like lemon, hot sauce, or a special sauce called mignonette. Oysters are priced based on their size and the different oyster variety or species.
That was a slideshow. And that's most of the pins. We only skipped a few. Anybody want to check out another one? What do you think, Ford? Can we check out some more pins?
I'm trying to think if there's any different technology ones are.
To grow oyster larvae, oyster hatchery farmers also need to grow their food. Oyster larvae eat tiny algae cells called phytoplankton.
So there's this 360 video again, I believe.
Yeah, fertilizer to grow. Oyster hatchery farmers grow different types of phytoplankton that come in a variety of colors. This colorful phytoplankton mix ensures oyster larvae eat a complete and balanced diet.
So that was the 360 video. Oyster. This was a cool day. Very Pacific Northwest with the fog. With a VR headset, it'll be like kids are on the boat too.
Yeah, you can spin all the way around, I imagine.
Yep, all the way around. Oh. I think the only other pin we haven't tried is this one. This is a Pana guide. So it's a 360 image. You can kind of look around all the equipment.
There is chemistry in raising oysters too. Increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere cause ocean acidification, and it's a global issue. This can make seawater more acidic. If the water used to raise oyster larvae comes from the sea, with a pH that is too low or acidic, the larvae can die. Monitoring and adjusting the seawater helps oyster larvae grow.
It's link to those. You click on a different pin.
This screen allows staff to visually see and monitor the changing levels of chemistry in the incoming seawater.
Instruments like this percolator acts as a buffering system, taking real-time data around hatchery workers to adjust water temps. This specific measuring tool is a pH monitor. With pH being so vital for the survival of oyster larvae, keeping a close eye on the water's pH level is important. This tank is in a different room and holds a chemical compound, sodium carbonate. Sodium carbonate is an important salt to adjust pH. When the acidity is too high, the pH meter sends a warning, and sodium carbonate is automatically added to the seawater.
Okay, folks. That is all the pins.
All right, thank you.
Say goodbye to that.
Thank you, Kristen and Ford. Are there any questions for this team? I did put a link in the chat for a survey, if you can do that before you sign off. Do you guys know, Kristen, do you know when this one will be live? Do we know yet?
So this app that I just showed you, the beta version, literally went live like 5 hours ago. So it was really cool to show it to y'all. The final version, I think all 4 of the apps are going to be published at the end of the month or the first week of March.
Perfect. Somebody said this is so interesting. Our Eastern Oregon friends. Does anybody else have any questions, comments, anything related to anything that Kristen, Ford, anybody
so do
can
these
answer?
usually just come in English? Like if you wanted to do a bilingual, a diverse audience, is it strictly in English? Is that something that they would consider doing bilingual? I mean,
So It is really cool. So because this is an app and it goes into the app store, there are a lot of specifications, especially to make sure that it's available to a diverse audience, especially an audience that doesn't speak English. So it will have auto captions in different languages. Yeah, so there's 4 apps. So it's the dairy, the oysters, horse, and urban farming. That was, I think that Educator PD was last month. So
that was Gail Angeletto's The Bees.
The bees, yep. So was there a part of the app that was like super cool and it's interesting? What stuck out the most? I know for me, going through this experience with Ford, just the fact that like farming on the water was a whole concept I've never really thought of. And the fact that oysters swim, I just kind of thought of them as like a delicious little rock, and that they just like didn't go anywhere. So the fact that like kids can learn like the biology of oysters and they actually like swim before they become that stationary rock. That was really neat.
So Jan and Dan say all of this was very interesting. Marina says this was interesting for me. I too, because my degree's in agriculture, not aquaculture, and so it was interesting to know some of the ag, relate it back to how the leasing and stuff. So that was great. How many careers are there in aquaculture, like off the top of your head?
Individual wise, individual people, that's a good question.
So different types of careers, like there's the farmers.
There's the farmers, which actually is where I thought I was going to go, and then academia kind of sucked me in. There's the academic research and the regulatory and the it's similar to ag, probably this, the ag supply end is also big. In the US, the primary area, it's the Southeast that is the main aquaculture area, mostly driven by catfish and these sorts of things. Shellfish is a close second, with both the Gulf states up along the East Coast, and then the Pacific Northwest with oysters. So it is all over, and there is an effort to try to expand it, but it's much like farming. I think there is if you want to be the farmer, there is the risk involved, the entrepreneurial spirit, and all that sort of, all those components too. I do think this sort of came up a little bit earlier, the STEM or the educational value of something like this. And aquaponics was brought up earlier. I think I had one in my backyard. It was relatively small scale. And my thought is, if as an introduction, and this could be a sort of the Eastern Oregon context too, as an introduction, you could in theory do for those of you who want to get hands wet, do something like aquaponics, because it would bring in the terrestrial plant aspect for those with green thumbs, and a fish species that's something as benign, as long as it's all contained, as goldfish or something like that, that are easy to grow, just to demonstrate all the principles involved. A lot of water chemistry, a lot of engineering with the pipes, and biology. So it is probably similar to ag in general. It's just a fantastic platform for STEM type education. But it is, I think, it can be an inland endeavor too. It's not restricted to the coast anyways.
Carrie, that's so cool. Carrie says, I don't know if you can see the chat, but our students live and have been to Whiskey Creek, so it's neat to see it as an app. The kids will love it. So
yeah, I was torn a little bit, our decision to bring Whiskey Creek into Yaquina Bay. I actually had to tell Alan that we did that, because I wanted to I wanted to keep it as true as possible and represent it as best, as best as I could. But there is the reality of how to stitch the app together, and it just wasn't going to happen totally separate. But it is fun to see, And he does a great job with explaining everything, and they run a good operation there.
Yeah, one thing that also like really stuck out for me learning more about oysters is how much they're impacted by climate change, but also how they could be like partners in helping to restore like ocean ecosystems, because they are an animal that filters seawater. They can filter like almost 30 gallons a day, just one oyster. So it's quite fascinating how they're also really good for the environment as well. So I think that's something that is really impactful for kids to learn, even if they don't like oysters.
Well, so Emily says, yes, the environmental science connection is strong. Thank you from our classroom teachers. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up? So let me see if there's one more. Nope, that's it. So thank you, Ford and Kristen, for this and all your hard work getting this done. When it does come out, everybody will be so excited. Those of you who can't attend it again tonight, thank you very much. I will make sure everybody knows, the higher ups, the big wigs know who was here. I recorded that. So thank you for that, and be well. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.